So we'll start out with this Black Diamond Mines area. And this was a fascinating look at this district. It was prospected for coal in the mid-1850s, and then about 5 towns grew up around the pit heads. And the last of the mines was closed, and all of the towns were deserted in about 50 years. But what they accomplished in these 50 years, allegedly, is interesting. And we're told most of the features are underground. There's too many blocked access ways or presence of water or toxic gases. And they claim that, we'll never know exactly the extent of the underground. But they say that there's a minimum 200 miles of underground access, a minimum, leading to 1,200 acres, which is pretty remarkable in 50 years, if that's the truth. There's a few areas. One is in Nortonville, where they claim there's residences. There's remains of about 50 homes and businesses. And they mark these homes by these little cellar holes, this little bowl-like depression, which is odd that that's all that's reduced to. 100 years ago, just a depression in dirt. But I don't know how they determine this, but much of the area has tailings that are sometimes 30 feet high, cover multiple acres, or boiler waste. Many of the openings were closed by local ranchers. Most of the equipment is gone, but there are some openings that are composed of brick. There's a few chimneys and some concrete bases. They think between 1860 and 1880, there about 400 acres were excavated in this area, and some of these rooms survive. There's a small, unusual hand-excavated room known as Jim's Place, suggesting that someone used to live here. Was it you, Jimmy? Then there's the Summersville area, which has Rose Hill Cemetery, and then other mines, Union Mine, Eureka, Manhattan, Independence, Hazel Atlas. And this place was only occupied for about 40 years. Berkeley did some excavations and found some water cisterns and uncovered a hotel building, 5 house lots. I don't know how it's got filled up already in 50 years. And I don't know how a town of 50 homes and businesses, what do you got, 200 people max? I don't know how they're possibly able to. The cemetery grave markers are range from 1865 to 1954, but many are from the 1870s and 1880s, and many of them have paternal symbols, Son of Temperance, Knights of Pythias, Oddfellows, Mason, the usual stuff. The 2 monuments that have been erected by the ever-questionable native daughters and sons of the Golden West, most of the headstones are broken or missing. There's one great house tunnel that has a near perfectly curved roof, but they can't get inside because of what a rancher has done. Some of these tunnels are 700 feet deep until they hit the horizontal connection, and all the underground is flooded. They've never been explored or mapped. And they say that in this area, of the thousands of acres of underground room, only a small few, like 20, were done by the sand mine. So all this happened in 50 years. And then there's the Stewartsville town site, and they say that Stewartsville, anytime there's a soil dislocation or storm, it reveals new building, new opening, and apparently talking with the locals, they uncover new opening all the time. I think in total they have about 300 sites. Sites meaning cellar holes, building platforms, tunnels. The story is that until the rise of oil, coal was the most cost-efficient energy source for these low-pressure steam engines. For lignite coal, is twice the thermal capacity of oak, and they use it in manufacturing and the railroads and river steamers, and they needed enormous amounts of coal to build up San Francisco. So between 1860 and 1893, more than 33 years, more than 23 million tons of coal were shipped to San Francisco, which was the hub of California's population and industry. These mines here supplied 25% of all the coal in San Francisco. This area over here by Mountain. And later on, in the 1920s, this area was mined for a few more years for the sand with a high silica content for a lot of the foundry used to construct the ships and the vehicles that were manufactured here at the same time. So this is where we start. The peak population of these towns was around 400 people at their highest. I'm not sure if I believe that's even possible to do all that. That's what I'm told. And we got the county courthouse block here. We're told this flat courthouse used to have an elaborate steel dome, but in 1957 it has sustained so much damage from the various earthquakes that it was in precarious condition, and so they removed the dome. And it is of the opinion of the county building department that the building looks better without it. Right. The basement of this building was initially the jail until they built a new one. William Topke was the architect for this place, and we're told that the dome survived the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, but weakened by the Bay Area quake in 1987 was when it actually was removed. And this complex takes up the whole block. And right here, that was the old courthouse, and this is the new-ish courthouse. Toll was built in 1932 with 3 stories and a basement, and we're told it was made during the Depression. Expert workmanship, tell you that. Just look at that bad boy. And it is in Martinez, and good old architect Jeffrey Bangs worked here on this bad boy. And we're told that this was just office for records, cattle brand books, census records, voting records, all that sort of stuff. Marriage licenses, rather substantial building for a hall of records. Bangs was the guy who built the Berkeley campus, allegedly. We're told February 18th, men began pouring the concrete. 6 weeks later, they began the riveting, and 6 months later, the cornerstone was laid under the auspices of the Grand Lodge of Masons of California, with a big parade of the Masonic Temple led by police escort, representatives from the county's 12 Masonic lodges, the Kiwanis Glee Club sang, Martinez Boy Scouts were ushers, Associated Oil Company had installed the public address system, and on the cornerstone was the date in Roman numerals, and a copper box. They put building plans, Masonic records, and county newspapers. The Grand President of the Native Sons of the Golden West directed the ceremony. How about that? A ritualistic introduction into the world. That's what this building got. So next we'll go to the Danville Southern Pacific Railroad Depot. And again, not necessarily interesting because of the actual building, though they say that the foundation of it is brick and the walls are made of wood. It was constructed in 1891, and it remains today as it was built with no alterations to its basic structure. I think it's a museum now today. But the story behind it is, well, it follows the 3 different phases of farming that this area went through. First, the early settlers had raised cattle, and then they discovered that the climate and the dry farming method there was better for the growing of wheat and barley and hay. And eventually hay took over, the lead product, and it was shipped to the Army cavalry posts and to markets in other countries. And they would have these warehouses that stored as much as 3,500 tons of hay, like awaiting shipment. And then the third chapter was the fruit and the nut era. And that was kind of underway. The coming of the train, because of its available shipping service, encouraged more of these products. So the depot, which is now in the center of the area, it was built to serve the transportation needs of the farming community so they could ship these farm products. So this improvement then, versus the time-consuming horse and wagon transportation after these narrow, muddy roads, made it so that the outside world was linked for farm families so they can travel and have visitors, which is a privilege long denied them in this region. They began to ship foods that would normally be disposable, such as eggs, and it encouraged this type of agriculture to flourish in the area. So the foundation is brick and mortar piers, then was added these 8x8 wooden posts to raise the freight room floor level. And there were originally decorative crusting and finials on top that were removed in the early 1900s. I don't know why you would put something on and remove it within, 10 years or so, but they did. The chimneys were brick that were built for wood-burning stoves, which are now removed. And this area, the San Ramon Valley, following the gold rush, was settled by families moving west from the eastern part of the U.S. The roads were trash until this railroad came along. As I said, they would be able to ship eggs, walnuts. Farmers planted peaches, prunes, apricots. There were great pear orchards, which made the valley the pear capital of the world. Cherries did well here. After the coming of the railroad, the center of activity in Danville was moved actually from the Front Street area to the area around Railroad and Harts. This man named Harts allowed his farm to be divided by the track, and then he had this property surveyed into small town lots with streets laid out, which became the first subdivision, and the center of the town essentially shifted to this subdivision. And aside from moving military personnel and materials during World War II and a few excursion trips, passenger service ended after only 40 years, 1931, and then freight service stopped in the 50s, owned by the town of Danville, and they were turning into a museum. This story of Mr. Hart's, this seems to be a theme, and it just makes you wonder, is there like a class that these guys went to? It seems as if within these societies, these Knights of Pythias and Mason groups, and they passed on, along with other knowledge, a sort of mission. And this is just reckless speculation. I have no proof of this, but it seems to me like they laid out a plan, and it almost became a race. And they said, here's the plan. You move into an area, you purchase the land, then you allow the railroad to pass through this land, then you can subdivide it out into lots, sell those lots, get a town going, name the town after yourself, encourage all the farmers in the area to grow crops, exploit the land as much as possible, ship all the riches from the interior of these countries into these cities, and eventually into the war machine, and you can live in infamy and wealth and splendor if you're able to do this. And this seems to be the race where these like resettlers or resetters types were all sent out with this mission to do this, and some succeeded and some didn't, and sometimes they would compete, and that was kind of the game, because for all of these men to stumble upon this idea at the same time, it's possible. But in the age of not the age of information, where mail is being delivered by wooden wheel wagon over muddy roads. I mean, I mail out packages constantly on eBay Market and stuff like that, and the amount of things that happen in the mail today with all of our digital tracking and everything, the amount of mishaps is numerous. It's a large percentage, and so I can imagine imagine the error, the transaction rate of success must have been much lower back then, when you have horses spraining ankles and riders getting thrown from them and dying in the desert, no one knowing, and all the letters dying with them, or wagons breaking down, or rain ruining letters, and so the addresses can't be read. You can imagine the number of things that could possibly go wrong, and it just seems odd that all these guys were spread out and knew this strategy. And like I said, it's just reckless speculation, but the more I read, the more it seems like that was an intended goal. And then when the area sort of dried up, or when the situation changed slightly, or there was a new technology introduced, then these areas were just abandoned and left, bereft of jobs, and then these people are forced to move into the cities. You see this all across the country. California might be the most obvious right now to me, because California is the one I'm very familiar with and deeply studying. So, but I imagine that this happens in West Virginia. I'm sure it happened everywhere. Any territory or state that existed in the 1850s. That just seems to be a trend. The trend of members belonging to secret societies, and then the plan to lure the railroad to your town, preferably through your land or near it, so that you can then plot the land out for lots and sell them. You name the street after yourself, and then you name the town after yourself, and that's the game. That's the cycle. The cycle is exploit as many things as you possibly can and people, regardless of what damage you're doing to the earth, and the damage you're doing to society, and the damage you're doing to human lives. Get the wealth, live like a king, and then at the end of your life, sort of give it away and fund orphanages, and become a philanthropist. And then in your waning days of life, your legacy will be incredible, and people speak highly of you. You'll be known as a philanthropist, and the Carnegie path. I don't mean to offend people or generalize people, but this seems the Catholic Church way of life. Live however you want during the week, as long as you confess on the weekends, you're good. Live however you want, as long as you, at the very end, do some wholesome things, you'll be okay. You'll get to go to heaven. Your legacy, people speak fondly of you. And to me, it's a very ego-focused way of life, and it's harmful. Wouldn't you just want to live life so that you benefit everyone and everything around you, regardless of your legacy? It's a strange mentality. I don't understand it. But nonetheless, it seems to be what the strategy of a lot of these old resetter types in these early days seem to be following. And they even go so much as to say things like this. But anyway, we'll jump over here to this in Antioch, the Roswell Butler house, which is not very interesting other than the date of construction was allegedly 1869. At the time, we're told it was the only one made of local hard red brick, with the usual ornamental iron fence and brick chimneys. Many of the plantings dating to the 19th century of the gardens around there, the lemon trees, the cedar trees, the pepper trees, ceilings being unusually high, and the cistern on the property. As usual, it's not just a house chosen at random to represent the area. It's the home of the first mayor of Antioch, Roswell Butler Hard, the first meeting place of the Board of Trustees. And Mr. Roswell B. Hard was one of the funny name. Sounds like a pirate describing someone's. Roswell B. Hard these days was one of the early pioneers in Antioch. He carved out a place in history for his contributions to the growth of Antioch with his civic and public life. He was born in Jericho, Vermont, married Leonora Humphrey, moved to California in 1852, an active Mason, of course, there it is. He was a butcher and a builder and a businessman and a rancher, because, you could do everything back then. He was also influential in county politics, was the county supervisor for 2 years. He was the sheriff at the same time he was county supervisor. In 1868, after the jail was damaged by an earthquake, the county board of supervisors, of which he was also sat on, authorized himself to build the jail and set aside funds for its construction. He appointed his brother in a bit of nepotism as David as deputy sheriff, and together they built the jail. And they also built their own residences, and they built another 2-story brick building that's unnamed as well. He was elected to mayor by the board of trustees, of which he also was a member, after Antioch was approved for incorporation in 1872 by the state legislature, and the first and all subsequent meetings of the board of trustees took place in the front parlor of his house around the fireplace. Hard to disagree with a man who's also the sheriff, and you're in his house for the meeting. That's why this house, which was also used as the local chapter of the Masonic order for their monthly fraternal meetings. I mean, talking about conflict of interest, he was the mayor until 1874, involved in community life until his death in 1888, and that's why this house is on the registry. And none of that should come to any surprise to anyone following these stories. Why it's boarded up today and looking unremarkable, that doesn't matter, because folks, this is about the narrative. Next we head to a suspicious area called the Alvarado Park, which is 42 acres of sloping land on the west side of the Richmond Hills. And it was chosen for the lushness of the damp tree-lined canyon, we're told, and the rock prominence that marks the entrance. The original developer called it the Grand Canyon Park, but the name was changed in 1923, and it was allegedly a showpiece of nature within the patchwork of residential lots that his company had subdivided. It was touted as a natural wonder. However, from its earliest inception, the park is essentially urban. There's a liberal use of concrete, thousands of feet of freestanding and retaining walls, barbecue stoves of cast concrete, rock and broken concrete concrete slabs, a stone bridge, things like that. Now, the first phase in the history of the park is very poorly documented. It's not possible to inventory reliably all the improvements. The terraced flat was leveled, which is now a parking lot. There was a fenced baseball field constructed in 1911, an open-air pavilion and dancing platform built to the northeast of the baseball diamond, and it was later remodeled into a skating rink, but this was gutted by fire, and the second floor was demolished, and the integrity is severely compromised, as you would imagine. There was also a slide, 220-foot slide, that was built on the hillside where visitors would sit on pieces of canvas and slide down the slope, which had been freshly waxed. The slide was demolished, however, in 1924, and there's a rocky prominence outside the park, a restaurant built in 1911 known as the Chateau, and the frame building still stands, although the exterior is apparently much altered. There was a concrete dam that was built downstream to create a boating lake that reportedly extended well above the present bridge site, but the dam was washed out in the 20s. Nothing remains. Where the city of Richmond took over from 23 to 33, it was said to have been a poison oak jungle, which is weird, considering the park's only been in existence for 10 years, and already it's a poison oak jungle with dilapidated facilities somehow. So the city demolished the slides, cleans up the poison oak, repairs the pavilion, and this is the first time there's any actual documentation about the rock and concrete and the money spent on those stairs and retaining walls. And there's cream-colored stone over gray stone, all sorts of a mix of materials, including concrete spread over solid gray stone. Not much of this is still standing. And in phase 3, which took place from 34 to 39, this is where a pilot program of the Works Progress Administration, which was established with the goal of distributing money to state and local government for public works, and agencies were snapping up the funds, and the city engineer of Richmond had filed 17 project applications in 1934, received grants through State Emergency Relief Administration once they started just printing money at will and giving it out to anyone with an idea, and this is when they constructed the picnic sites and the barbecue stoves and the stone light poles, or the electroliers. And since then, the original tables and benches have been replaced, we're told. The bridge is still there, which is the most impressive feature. Some of the lampposts, these pieces are actually roughly broken concrete slab that are stacked and cemented together, and it's speculated that this material was actually just reused sections of old sidewalk, which is something that apparently occurred often in Richmond City, based on their council minutes. There are some cast concrete and brick stoves, and a wide stairway of stacked concrete, and much of the early stuff is gone, though apparently footings remain all over the site, and it's a little suspicious to me. I wonder what it was actually all about. What actually existed here before. It seems like ruins that they sort of repurposed and rearranged into a park, which wouldn't be unlike many places that we see around the country tend to do this sort of thing. Next, we have the Bank of Pinole, which is a small single-story neoclassic masonry building constructed in 1915 by banking pioneer Edward M. Downer Sr., whose name pops up all over this county. It's located in the historic downtown corridor of Pinole, surrounded by the semi-rural hills, and there are vacant lots at either side of the building, but that was originally infilled with two-story masonry buildings. In 1905, Edward Downer Sr. builds a small bank with a capital of $12,000. 10 years later, he realized the growing community's need for a secure building to house their assets. So his response was the neoclassic Bank of Pinole, which is located across the street from his original bank. Before construction of the Bank of Pinole in 1915, the property, the lot, contained a single-story dwelling of unknown origin. So I guess they bulldozed it and rebuilt the bank, allegedly. It actually doesn't say that, but what else can we possibly come to believe if they say that there was a property already there? October 1939, it was bought by Bank of America National Trust, and the building was remodeled and turned into a youth center in 1964. The Bank of Pinole remains the only neoclassic building in a community which consists of over 20 historically distinct architectural styles in a downtown core, which is less than half a square mile. Eventually, there were 16 banks that were founded in Contra Costa County by descendants of Mr. Edward Downer Sr. He was also the mayor of Pinole from 1913 until his death in 1938. Just gonna sprinkle that in there. He was also the mayor at the same time he created this bank. No conflict of interest there. The longest serving mayor, I believe, in the area, 25 years. His banks were known as the Mechanics Bank, and the central branch is located in Richmond and is managed by his grandson. Jump over here to the Clayton de Martini Winery, which is an 8.3-acre parcel, and it's the remaining portion of a 28-acre vineyard planted in the 1860s. The winery itself is a 3-story building built into a hill. The first 2 stories are made of sandstone, and the third is made of wood. The first 2 floors are about 12 feet high. The third is 14 feet high. These differences lead me, your faithful editor, to come to the conclusion that they were built in 2 distinct eras, though that's not what we're told. We're told also that the stone walls that serve as retaining walls, where the first 2 levels are below grade. These stone walls consisted of stone blocks. blocks. At the second level, the stone has broken faces and appears to be more rubble in nature. The date 1885 is chiseled on 3 inner walls. So apparently, again, to me, it seems like this was a structure that was broken, and it was only one that was set into the hill or flooded out, however you want to interpret that, and they constructed the second, part of the second and the third floor later. Though that's not the official story. The original vineyards are no longer there. There's a few vines that run along the creek between the ruins of the Sherry House and Clayton Road. So Joel Clayton is a man who immigrated to Massachusetts from England in 1837, and he gained fame primarily from his role in discovering the Black Diamond coal field we talked about earlier and founding the town that bears his name. Before migrating to California in 1850, he worked in the lead mines of Illinois and the zinc mines of Wisconsin. With a number of other experienced miners, he comes to California first in search of gold, and then of the profits to be made selling coal in the markets of San Francisco, Sacramento. So Clayton, the one street town named after him that he laid in 1857, was just initially an adjunct to his coal operations, a village to house and supply the miners who worked the Mount Diablo coal field. Early land records relate primarily to the purchase of developing mining claims. In 1861, after the coal field proved unprofitable, somehow he took these unprofits and turned to agriculture and acquired 1,200 acres, and 2 years later planted 28 acres in grapes, establishing Clayton Vineyards. In March 1870, after the vines had matured, he built the distillery for making brandy from the grape, known as the Sherry House. So he's responsible for the first vineyard in the Clayton area and for introducing wine manufacturing to the area, and though he's primarily a farmer, in 2 years, he had created 6,000 gallons of wine and 250 gallons of brandy. This was all done in 2 years, which is odd because it takes some time to age brandy and wine. So this would have to be his first run at it. It's interesting that it would be just immediately successful. Kind of sounds a little suspicious, but his heirs, after his death, terminated the wine business. This is 1874. They sold the stock of wine, and they rented the vineyard and the Sherry House to its future owner, which was Paul Di Martini. And this gentleman, born in Italy, parallels Clayton in some ways. They both immigrated at the age of 17, although Di Martini came to Calaveras County in search of gold. He spent 4 years mining, moves to Concord, and eventually Nortonville, which is one of the coal towns, Black Diamond Mining District, and he runs a boarding house there. He buys the Clayton Vineyards. State Viticulture Report for 1881 claims that 300 acres of Contra Costa regions by this point were planted in grapes. In 1897, the local press was reporting an increase to 6,000 acres. A historian in 1882 claimed that
no portion of the county is so peculiarly adapted to the growth of grapes as that surrounding the town of Clayton. The land in that vicinity is essentially grape soil, and the climate is especially favorable for grape raising. It is safe to say that sometime in the not remote future, Diablo Valley will be one vast vineyard, and that Clayton wine will be manufactured equal to any produced in the state.
to take advantage of this growth, Mr. Di Martini imported stonemasons somehow to construct the large winery that we discussed, which was in front of the Sherry House, which he had acquired in 1876. Built by Dragovich and Cavagnaro, the building was completed in 1885, and he expanded production using grapes from his own 20 acres as well as 200 tons he purchased from neighboring growers. Becomes one of the major wineries in the area, one of the few large wineries in the state under Italian ownership. In addition to the ports and the sherries, which brought first prizes at the 1903 St. Louis World's Fair, the winery also produced Zinfandel. And in 1897, the winery's production ranked second in the county, 200,000 gallons, surpassed only by Martinelli's Mount Diablo winery. So in 1917, 20 years later, there's 50 wineries in the county, and the vineyards had become famous the world over. His economic success was followed by social and political prominence in the community, of course. He was elected in 1896, so before his actual success, he was elected to the Contra Costa County Board of Supervisors, a Democrat. He joined the board as representative of the 2nd District. It's worth noting that Charles Clayton's son, Joel, was also a Republican representative of the 4th District. Now, despite his success in the wine industry, they were threatened by forces beyond his control. There's these highly extravagant claims of prohibitionists and members of the Anti-Saloon League and paid reformers predicted the prohibition wave broke, and the methods of his advocates are discredited, and prohibition and the Great Blight spelled the end for Clayton's string of wineries. Nationwide prohibition made the winemaker at age 76 remove most of the vines from his property and plant the lands at almonds. Good old government. Always jumping in and ruining a good thing, after they enable it. Now, there's many properties in this one that we've already covered. I'm not going to go into depth about, including the Kaiser shipyard and the Ford assembly plant in Richmond. Tens of thousands of jobs. And they abruptly pulled out after the war, the Ford assembly plant later than the shipyard, and kind of cast the whole area into a little bit of a depression with all those jobs leaving. I've already discussed those in multiple details in the California American Building Survey, but it is worth reminding of what was happening in the area. John Marsh House, also we covered in the Historic American Building Survey. He was the first Anglo guy to settle in the area, built this big castle-looking thing. and was promptly murdered. He was the first physician in the area, though not actually a doctor, but he did graduate from Harvard. I guess that was enough back then. There is a site known as the Marsh Creek Park. It's actually not even open to the public, and they don't list the address here, but it surrounds the John Marsh House. And there's a 350-page submission for approval. It was actually signed into effect by Governor Schwarzenegger, and I ran through it, and I found it to be startling in a number of ways. First off is it's segregated because of its importance as an archaeological find, because there's a people called the Windmillers, which they claim lived here thousands of years ago. And apparently this site and the John Marsh House and this whole area is inundated with archaeological artifacts. In fact, they tore up the first floor of this house to excavate underneath it, and they found human remains. And they found the human remains essentially everywhere they've dug in this area, along with pottery and glass and things of this nature. But it was startling to me how everywhere they dug, every excavation they ever made, they struck human remains. And they claim these are ancient burial sites. I have my doubts, because they also claim that there was a lake this actually was a lakefront property at once, which is no longer there. There was a dam that is no longer there. And it just seems like perhaps this whole area was occupied by people a lot more recently than thousands and thousands of years. This is sort of the story we've come up with to explain perhaps what we don't know. I'm not sure. It is strange to have this massive state park, but you still feel the need to dig up the floor of the one property in the area, and still you find human remains. Very odd, although you kind of have to go through some severe back channels to end up with that information. Now we have the town of Hercules, which is actually a historic district. Technically, it's a village, and it was a population of several hundred. Now the majority of them are vacant, especially at the time of the writing, so who knows about now, even it's probably 20 years later, 30 years later. And it was vandalized and abused, both unauthorized and authorized. Authorized abuse, I like that. And scheduled for possible demolition. The company buildings on the hill were intact, and the social and utilitarian buildings were intact and vacant. The parent of Hercules was the California Powder Works, which was incorporated in 1861, operated in Santa Cruz, and it was the first incorporated powder company in the far west, which was affording explosives for gold miners and for the building of the railroad. The first president was Captain John Baird, a 49er. He was elected to the state senate, and in 1869, the California Powder Works began manufacturing dynamite in San Francisco. The explosive was at that time called Black Hercules powder, which became its major product. The plant was called Hercules Powder Works, and because of explosions and an encroaching population, the California Powder Works was forced to move to a less inhabited area. The site chosen to construct this powder works was the present-day Hercules. So land was purchased from the heirs of Don Ignacio Martinez, and they also bought a second parcel of land in 1888, which was a marshland, or a floodplain. The deed included a covenant that prohibited the California Powder Works from ever manufacturing any explosives on a section of land that comprises the Old Village, which was shielded from the plant by a hill. And this is where it was the site of the residences of the workers that were employed by the powder works. Over the ensuing 2 decades, Hercules becomes the largest producer of dynamite in the world. Eventually, during World War I, it becomes the largest producer of TNT in America. Supplied explosives to both sides, like every good company, until America entered the war. The first plant explosion was January 11th, 1882, and was felt nearly 35 miles away. At least 6 other explosions had occurred, 2 in 1892, 1 in 1895, 1896, 1898, 1899. The most disastrous one was February 20th, 1908. By the end of the 19th century, the town was incorporated. It was the 3rd incorporated town in the county. And so it was a company town by and large. One of the important features was the Hercules Club, which was founded in 1896 by a few employees. There were 2 groups of homes. One was in the area commonly called the Hill, which was the administrative personnel and the families, less crowded, more style. The other group, which was built on the side of the sloping hills, was separated and accommodated the working class and their families. There was also a clubhouse and a resident physician-staffed hospital. They had abundant recreational facilities, including tennis courts and a baseball field. Now, all the residents were employees. However, none were afforded the hundreds of Chinese workers. In 1903, the plant and the homes were absorbed by the DuPont Company, and then DuPont Holdings were dissolved by decree, the Sherman antitrust law, and assigned to the new Hercules Powder Company, and eventually the plant becomes manufacturing agricultural chemicals. So in spite of the changes within the industry, this town has remained essentially unchanged for 3/4 of a century. Only until 1980, community atmosphere kind of dissolved and a portion of the homes were destroyed in preparation for total redevelopment. An interesting point here is there is a referenced archaeological site indicated on the map. There is confusion as to the existence of any substantial archaeological material, that they're vague about what these artifacts are. The exact location is not pinpointed, but there's a statement here by George Cales that says it's under the Lions Club or Masons Hall, just across the street outside of the project area. The site located inside the project area has not been recorded because it was just dumped there along with a whole lot of other fill material. So I'm not sure what sort of archaeological artifacts they found and dumped and then built a mason hall on top of it, but it's a data point to consider. There's another series of homes here and properties that are very interesting, not because of what they are exactly, and I'll show the photos of them here, but because of the process. I imagine things like this happen all over the world, all over the country, but this is, it's strangely documented here because anytime that there's a submission for the National Registry, the archives will file all these things together. So the original submission or any objections, as we've learned in the past, is some very interesting things that come from these letters, such as the Cortland Gross thing that happened in Kern County. And in Martinez, Martinez specifically, there's a different sort of situation that has unfolded. And there's a local historian who seems very dedicated, and very informed, who submits properties, and her name, I believe, is Kristen Henderson, that get challenged by the Historic Society. And the back and forth with the letters, of which there are, some of these properties literally have hundreds of emails back and forth from her, from various county officials, from the Historical Society. And what is clearly put on display is that the Martinez Historical Society has been accused of essentially shady dealings. In other words, they take kickbacks in order to allow land and properties to be developed and bulldozed and demolished by claiming they're not historic. And so this person has been waging this war for years, submitting properties with documentation. I mean, I've read thousands of these registration forms, literally thousands, from grad students from the earliest days till the modern days, the changes that they've made. I've read through literally thousands of examples of these. Hers are very thorough. Not only do they meet the criteria perfectly, they go above and beyond as far as providing extensive sourcing, which most don't do, in the form of newspaper clippings, magazine articles, even chapters from books reporting on historical scenes in the area. And she includes all of these. The standards are very high, yet they keep getting rejected because of this Historical Society tries to discredit her. And it becomes pretty clear that they are acting as one, and she brings the receipts and shows the corruption at hand and how they are basically in bed with local politics and local builders. That, you would assume anyone that's on the Historical Society team or board actually cares about the heritage of the area. Apparently they didn't here at this point in time in Martinez. It's a very revealing read. If you're into reading hundreds of people's emails back and forth, tracing your way through the chain, it's just an insight into sometimes how this goes on. And when I look at things big picture, what I feel is, I tie everything into a spiritual war personally. That there's some power somewhere up the chain that wants to destroy a lot of this history, or at least acts in wanton disregard of it. It's just interesting to see that those tentacles can stretch into even places like Historical Society, where you would think the only thing they would actually focus on would be the heritage of the area. And instead, that mankind are so easily swayed by greed. They're so quick to sway and have weak resolve when it comes to moral principle, something that you suspect always, but when it's thrown in your face, it's alarming. This area has this school. What you've been looking at here is the school annex, the Martinez School, the Martinez Post Office, the Martinez Library. All of these are really impressive buildings that belie an older time. And who knows, without valiant people like her fighting for their featuring on these, would they even exist? And when you look at photographs of Martinez in particular in this era, it's beautiful, charming, wonderful place that has so much of this old world splendor, and most of it is just gone. Very little of it left, unless it told the narrative or unless some fighter like her comes along and insists and fights the courts and makes it happen. So hats off to her and all people like that. I'm grateful for different reasons. I think that probably preserving cultural heritage, if you live in the area, and landmarks is important. However we get there. Next, we have a memorial hall in Crockett. And this little memorial hall here, out of a funny little building, unincorporated town of Crockett, settled in 1867 by Thomas Edwards. He bought the land and named the town after the man he bought the land from, Judge Joseph B. Crockett. In conjunction with the construction of the railroad in 1877, he makes it a prime site for industrial development. In 1884, the Star Flour Mill and warehouses were erected as part of the expanding grain industry along the Carquinez Strait. And in 1897, the newly formed California Beet Sugar and Refining Company bought the site and the buildings of the flour mill and the Edwards Ranch lands, and they changed its name to California and Hawaii Sugar Refining Company until 1903, when it briefly shut down, reopened into a California and Hawaiian Sugar Refining Corporation, which we know now today as C&H. So Crockett essentially becomes a C&H company town. Company funded infrastructure infrastructure, roads, sewers, parks, playgrounds, built community buildings, schools, libraries, recreation centers, opened up tracts of lands for development, helped employees with the financing of their homes, and the majority of Crockett residents were employed by C&H. The American Legion, in another part of the world, which was being conceived in 1919 in Paris, they wrote up a constitution, was formally approved in St. Louis, and it was the commitment to preserve the memories and incidents of our associations in the Great War, and established an executive committee to grant charters to state organizations, which in turn would charter local posts. The American Legion Post 33 in Crockett was established soon after the American Legion was organized. Interesting because it's not even a town. It's just a tiny place. But regardless, after the end of the war, government bodies and veterans groups began erecting memorials dedicated to those who served. Contra Costa's county's Board of Supervisors voted to construct a memorial in every town that had an American Legion post. So in July, C&H donated 3 lots for the sole purpose of constructing a memorial hall. A. Brown, an employee of C&H, was hired by the company to complete the design, which was an octagonal hall in the classic revival architectural style. Several communities, the memorial halls have been demolished already, but this project was executed through significant assistance of C&H Sugar. It's an odd building. Half of it's underground, and looks like the base of a tower to me. They kind of repurposed, but interesting. Some of these photographs here under construction, and it's odd that it's the only thing out there, except for a few power lines in the late 20s. And they had to reconstruct the basement because of flooding and things like that. And some of the other ones, like the one in Lafayette and Brentwood and Walnut Creek, have all been demolished. This one stands alone. And they claim the upper stairs auditorium can hold 124 people. I don't see that unless it's really jammed in there. But yeah, that's the story of what we're told about that hall. Next up, we got the William T. Hendrick House, built in 1857, single story with a raised basement. Much of the interior has been left intact with very few changes. And the house is one of the last remnants of the early town, which was in Pacheco, and once was a major center of activity in the county. William Hendrick was the owner of the largest flour mill in the county, which was located directly to the south of his home. He was 29 years old in 1857 when he came to Pacheco, accompanied by his wife. Personal finances being meager, he built a small house, which still survives. And Pacheco was the hub of activity for the county for a brief period of time. Maybe 1858, 1873 is what we're told. Cattle herds in the area were diminished. Settlers turned their efforts to raising grain, as we've seen in other parts of the county. And the town of Pacheco, as we're told by the Contra Costa Gazette in 1860, was
one of the newest in the state, only a year and a half old. Shipping port of Pacheco, San Ramon, Diablo, and Taylor valleys. While the distance to Martinez is 4 miles. Further, the farmers like to haul their grain when they can avoid it. To bring the shipping port near to them, Pacheco was built, and last year Pacheco shipped 180,000 sacks of grain.
Anticipating the rising demand for a mill, William T. Hendrick erected one steam engine fueled by coal taken from nearby Nortonville. And every day the mill team made a trip to the coal mines to bring back a load of soft coal. This mill
runs by steam power has been kept very busy for the last 4 or 5 weeks. Night and day for a month past with scarcely any intermission. The process of converting wheat into flour has been going on. The average quantity of flour manufactured is about 100 barrels per day, or about the amount of 3,000 barrels per month.
William T. Hendrick was an influential member of the community of Pacheco. Many people congregated at the mill and at his home while waiting for their flour to be ground. Mr. Hendrick was the founder of the first Oddfellows Lodge in the area. You guessed it. He was also treasurer of the Contra Costa Agricultural Society somehow, and the Pacheco Engine Company No. 1, which is the Social and Fire Protection Society. Earthquakes and fires plagued the growth of Pacheco. The biggest deterrent, however, was the yearly flooding in the area. The citizens of the town undauntedly struggled to conquer the area. Here's an article by the editor of the Contra Costa Gazette in 1862, which says,
"The creek is open, and the flourishing town of Pacheco is surrounded by unfathomable depths of mud and water. Business is dull, and our town is not in holiday attire. Still, Phoenix-like, we have twice arisen from the ashes, and within us we feel the inherent strength necessary for another rising, and know it will come. What fire would not consume, water will not quench. Hence, Pacheco may be said to be unstopped."
However, 6 years later, it was stopped as the leaders of the area began to relocate. Hendrick himself sold the house and mill and left, and Don Salio Pacheco, the large landowner, laid out a new town site that eventually became Concord, California. And by 1900, Pacheco resembled a ghost town. That was quick. Mud and water and fire. I just doomed the place, and it's gone 30 years later. Very interesting stuff we find all over this county, isn't it? Well, at least I find it interesting. I don't know. You guys might be totally bored. Next up, we get the Port Costa School. 2-story, classically detailed brick and stucco building building. Yeah, the small town of Port Costa. On April 4th, 1911, the residents of Port Costa School District voted to incur a bonded indebtedness of $15,000 for the erection of the school. They began in August, and it was completed a mere 5 months later. It served as a grammar school for grades 1 through 8 until its closure in 1966. During its 54-year history, approximately 600 children graduated. The building was designed by William Wilde, good old Willie Wilde, who came here from Denmark in 1907. Already practiced in San Francisco in 1908. In 1910, he was designing the grammar school in Martinez. And then this year, and then in 1912, he also won the competition for the now demolished, for no apparent reason, Martinez City Hall. The Port Costa School, while not a costly building, is representative of the kind of dignified and well-planned building which was appropriate for rural community needs. 600 kids only graduated from that in 50 years? Doesn't that seem a little small to have a school like this? That's all we're told about her. Speaking of schools, we got the Riverview Union High School, built by architects from Oakland, Cumming and Weymouth. God, I wish I was kidding. Those are their names. That's the name of the firm. Someone's kidding, but it's not me. From the state's inception in 1850, California laws provided financial support for public education and indoctrination. The elementary school system was established first, the high school came later, and Union High School districts were legally established in 1890. So adjoining elementary school districts could basically combine and create a Union High School district, which the 16 elementary districts in eastern Contra Costa County did. Formed after Henry Fuller Bede, the owner of Antioch Lumber Company and the newly formed Antioch Women's Club, always one of those, supported the new district. The Riverview Union High School district therefore bought land in Antioch for a new high school, but Pittsburgh residents objected. They wanted the school. Another site was proposed in the southern part of Antioch. This too was rejected by Pittsburgh. Charles Appleton Hooper donated for a $10 gold coin 2 blocks of land between Antioch and Pittsburgh. The deed stipulated the land had to be used for a high school building, and it had to be built within 2 years of July 6, 1910, or the land would go back to him. Weird criteria. It was bordered by a marsh, and this location was key. It had access to all the transportation system. Students came to the school by using one of the 3 major local roads, or the railroad, or the river. They came by foot, bicycle, horse, car, and bus. All communities were satisfied except for Antioch. The classrooms on the second floor were finished when the school opened. The first floor, or ground floor, were finished later. That's a strange way to do that, unless, of course, the first floor has something with it. Like it's full of mud. The school band played at the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, of course. In 1925, they dissolved the school district due to overcrowding, and now both towns could have their own building, but they both had outgrown this building. So there was a law that came out, it's interesting, after the mid-30s, the California earthquake law allegedly forced all other school buildings in the state to be evaluated. All non-standard brick buildings had to be fixed or replaced, which is why most brick buildings disappeared over time. The Riverview Union High School building was not affected since it was not at the time being used as a school building. It's a way to get rid of stuff. The building is now vacant. The things you learn in these surveys randomly that slip through the cracks, they never cease to amaze. Here we've got the Tucker home in downtown Martinez. Martinez began as a ferry stop in 1847 where prospectors would lie on the shores waiting for the ferry to take them across the Carquinez Strait onto the San Joaquin or Sacramento rivers, then onto the goldfields in the Sierra foothills. Thomas Brown and Colonel William Smith, who had married into the Don Ignacio Martinez family, surveyed the area. This home was built in 1877 on a hill in an old downtown Martinez middle-class neighborhood. It has a cement foundation on which we're told that 2 tin-lined garages were built under the original house along with a basement in the rear of the now first floor. The house was bolted to the foundation. It seems like an odd way to do that. It's entirely built of redwood. This person writes, there are 3 brick flues which run from basement to attic, which were used in most rooms for coal burning, built by Nantucket sea captain John Tucker. John Tucker had become prosperous as a result of the farming boom in the 1860s. He moved from a small house on Richardson Street to his new home before his untimely death only 3 years after its completion. One of the few high Victorian Italian homes left of what once were thousands. Mr. Captain John Tucker arrived in Martinez in 1851, built the house for his wife Mary. There were no bathrooms as the outhouse was located outside near the carriage house. When asked about this, he replied, "Hell, I didn't want the women folk of my family lolling around in the bathtub while I was out to sea. Yes, can't have a clean woman at home." The property was later sold to Judge, City Clerk, and Postmaster Franklin Glass, and this is when the structure was moved 100 feet down the hill and turned 90 degrees for some reason. The Charles Merrill House, 6,000 square foot residence, built in 1938, designed by Walter Ratcliffe for mining engineer Charles Merrill. Got a cool rock garden. This guy was born in Concord, New Hampshire, raised in San Francisco. Dad went to San Francisco at the end of the Civil War to work as a clerk. New bride followed her husband, making taking the ship by Panama in order to have her baby at her parents' house. Bachelor of Science degree in metallurgy and mining. He wrote his thesis on the cyanide process for recovering gold from ore, and in a few years perfected his techniques, which became to be known as the Merrill cyanide process, and the process remains in use today. He worked in the Janin labs along with future President Herbert Hoover, built an office for himself on the upper floor of a furniture company where his father worked, and traveled around making refinements to his cyanide process using zinc dust and innovating mining operations all over the world. Compensation was receiving a percentage of the gold that his process recovered at some of these places, and so by his late 30s, he had an international reputation and considerable wealth. Come back home, married a high school sweetie, fathered 4 children, and eventually ended up going to the federal government as part of the Homefront effort because Herbert Hoover, his fellow mining engineer, coworker, had invited him, and they were fast friends. At the time, Hoover was the United States Food Administration director. Merrill was placed in charge of the Division of Collateral Commodities. He served for 2 years until the war ended, maintained a strong friendship with Hoover for decades, and then built this country estate in Orinda at the height of the National Depression to show off his wealth. One estimates that nearly every silver gold mining operation in the world used products developed by him. He also landed a government contract with the Chemical Warfare Service for the manufacture of aluminum powder, which is used in large caliber shells fired from American battleships, and aerial firebombs dropped on German cities. Walter Radcliffe, the architect, was born in England in 1881 to Reverend Walter Radcliffe, moved from England to Southern California, San Diego, then Pasadena, finally to Berkeley, attended Berkeley High School, and then promptly became an architect, working in Berkeley and throughout the Bay Area, designing buildings in San Francisco and many colleges, including Berkeley, banks, Chamber of Commerce buildings, and all sorts of things. Featured in nearly every article for a year straight in San Francisco's Architect and Engineer California magazine, and this is one of the few houses that he actually built. Houses, I mean. Everything else is a monstrous old world building. The end. The new Carquinez Hotel. 5-story structure with basement. Freshly rehabilitated because you'll see in these pictures it looks like doo-doo. The 20s brought an exciting time for this country. Development was everywhere. Deals were made, businesses created, and many handsome buildings were built. Who could predict the Depression was just around the corner? Every city in the 20s had building projects that came to represent the people of those times. And every progressive city required one showcase building to conduct business with prospective developers and investors. And this hotel was just what that new community of Richmond needed. The hotel was not only conceived and built for the community by Mr. Edward M. Downer Sr., again, founder, president, and principal shareholder of the Mechanic Bank and mayor, broke ground on this bad boy October 14, 1925. Construction completed just in time in October 18, 1926, so 1 year. And everything we've talked about thus far, the Ford plant, the Standard Oil, and railway coming, all of those meetings met right here in this here hotel. From the time it opened until the 1970s, it was the only conference center in the city. Every significant history-making business meeting, dinner, or luncheon for the Chamber of Commerce was held right here. Every service and social club convened right here. Richard Nixon stayed right here. Now it's one of the few remaining historic resources in the city. Before the 20s, it was a farming community, and then the growth and prosperity in the United States and all that happened. Now it's an aging antique, and it definitely went through some rough time. I don't know how that happened so fast, but it did. Now there's a few other properties on here that I'm skipping. East Brother Island Lighthouse is very picturesque, and it's interesting to take a look at visually. There's a nice story about a family that lived here and ran the light, and the children who became adept at paddling 2 miles to shore to get anything they needed. And now it's automated. Well, it became automated after they decided to pay people to run them, and after the lenses were cracked in an earthquake, allegedly, and now it's a struggling Airbnb. In 1906, after the San Francisco earthquake and fire, the California Wine Association, an association of San Joaquin Valley grape growers, they purchased 47 acres near the city of Richmond, where in 1908 they built Wine Haven, allegedly. This peaceful, sheltered peninsula on the San Francisco Bay had been for many years the home of indigenous Native Americans. There are shell mounds and burial mounds on the property. The Indian tribes have been gone for a long time, and the principal residents were a few Greek and Maltese stoneworkers employed in a nearby quarry, and a camp of Chinese shrimp fishermen promptly stamped out of existence. They actually appear in this registry, but the location is undisclosed and there's no information. The first completed building was Wine Haven Hotel, 29 rooms, which was used to house the builders and then later the bachelor workers. Other workers lived aboard a riverboat that was anchored in the cove. Next to be built were the remarkable buildings of the winery. The winery had more than 3,000 vats for aging the wine, and there were more than 4 miles of passages between these great redwood tanks in the underground cellars. Cargo was carried along the wharf on an electric railway line, part of the special electric switching system that served the winery, and it was a great red brick castle of production. The famous California poet, allegedly Joaquin Miller, came here with his wife and daughter, was the one that planted the eucalyptus trees, allegedly, on this peninsula. Well, there's no certainty that those groves sprang from this source. However, on October 15th, 1919, the Volstead Act was ratified. Prohibition put an end to the activity. The California Wine Association struggled to contain its operation by making sacramental wine for churches and prescription wine for drugstores. And one day, the workers were paid off and sadly had to move out. And the winery vats were sealed. The cellars full of wine were an irresistible temptation, and the prohibition agents were kept busy trying to outguess the clever methods used to smuggle wine out to bootleggers. Finally, exasperated by the constant flow of wine out to illegal sources, the government prohibition agents ordered the bungs knocked out of the vats, and on that black day, 240,000 gallons of wine flowed into San Francisco Bay. It was said the next day that fishermen found it possible to pick drunken and amiably languid fish out of the water with their hands. It did not need to be cooked in wine, since they were full of it like that story. And we come to the Dollar House here. It's historically part of Rancho Sobrante de San Ramon, which is a Mexican land grant. The Mexican governor originally gave the land to two brothers who had lived there as early as 1833, but by 1847, the land had come under the jurisdiction of the United States, so when the brothers went to sell, they could not produce sufficient evidence of ownership. They had testimony of witnesses, but they didn't have a formal survey or their original title, claiming their lawyer had absconded with it to Georgia. So the commission rejected their claim. They fought on, appealing the decision to the Supreme Court in California, then the U.S. Supreme Court, and to pay for their legal defense, they were forced to sell off additional pieces of their rancho. By 1874, James Tice owned 357 acres and Andrew Tice owned 111 acres. And within a year or two, they sold a gentleman named Joseph Naphtali the 112-acre home ranch, including the site of what is now the Robert Stanley Dollar Senior Residence. Joseph Naphtali was a Prussian-born attorney, a prominent member of San Francisco's influential German Jewish community. He sat on the boards of several organizations, including Mount Zion Hospital, the Pacific Hebrew Orphan Asylum, and the California Democratic Party. Why are those organizations always linked? Orphans, Mount Zion Hospital, California Democrat. I mean, man. Anyway, get your hands off our orphans. Hebrew Orphan Asylum. Question over who owned the ranch remained unsettled long after Naphtali bought it. He was forcibly ejecting any homesteaders who attempted to settle. Ultimately, the Board of Commissioners gave him title to the 2,500 acres, though he never lived there. He did operate a winery on the site of what is now Del Valle High School, planted pear and apple orchards, and a vineyard to supply grapes. He was a major investor in an electric interurban line, and eventually the land company sold the ranch to Robert Stanley Dollar Sr., who is better known as Stan. He was a son of the prominent San Francisco shipping magnate Robert Dollar. Robert Dollar was a Scottish-born businessman who made his first fortune in lumber. He had bought this ranch in 1930 for all this, and this was a weekend destination for them. They did extensive research and analysis of building and real estate notices, and all the newspapers in the area failed to reveal any information on who may have hired to design and build it. It seems unlikely that a project of this size for a client of his stature would have failed to elicit the interest of the architecture or real estate development communities, but no contemporary newspapers or building journals contain any reference to this project. Allegedly, construction began in 1932, was completed in less than a year. The swimming pool, out the Arboretum. Downfall of his business doesn't seem to have affected his hobbies or his lifestyle. His son, though employed, seems to, Robert Dollar Jr., spent most of his time traveling as a competitive speedboat racer, where his number one rival was the son of the Kaiser shipyard. The Oakland Tribune Society pages from the 50s mention many illustrious guests staying at the compound. Dwight Eisenhower, John Dulles, Nelson Rockefeller, Richard Nixon, various other Republican governors of California, and senators from California, and they used this as a weekend home until he passed away in 1958. And eventually, it was taken up by a gentleman, Ross Cortese, who was a national developer of gated active adult communities. He founded Leisure World, despite naysayers saying older people would not want to be segregated. The developments quickly sold out, and they are still popular today. It's my hot take, I guess, on Contra Costa County. I muse about the stories we're told. It seems like just about everyone, except for a few of the civilian submitted, have just a touch of that hidden hand. Whether it's the strange case of the mayor also operating the bank and also being the sheriff and also funding the railroad, and whether it's the industry that rolls into town, exploits it, makes a ton of money, and then at the change of wind, walks away. And through all of it, there's a hint of a game being played. Now, call me a hyper-paranoiac. Maybe I'm just jumping at shadows. And that's fair. If the shoe fits, I will wear it. But all of these submissions have a part to play. It's about telling a story. It's not about memories and nostalgia and good old days. It's about a story to explain something. And I just get the overwhelming sensation that why are you trying to explain something so badly? History is open for interpretation, and this is how I interpret things. If it's just it was an unexplored area, and we rolled in, and man, we were just the bee's knees, and we figured it out real quick. But it just feels like there's a cover-up. And so I'm not saying that currently historians are doing this, not wittingly. These balls were set on this path and rolled, and you just see it everywhere in the Masonic and the Oddfellows mentioned everywhere, whether it's the Hercules village building a Mason Hall over an archaeological site, whether it's this new Carquinez Hotel, which is really only on there because all the deals that were struck there, which fed the other submissions on the registry, the Richmond Shipyard and the Dollar Steamship Lines and the Ford Motor Assembly Plant. You have the William Hendrick House, the guy that was an Oddfellows and fireman and built the second flour mill in the town. Not the first. The first one just scoots off in history untouched. But this guy, William Hendrick, he's one of the good old boys, so he gets a place. Winehaven is pretty obviously just an old star fort to me, with all the underground cellars and all those things. All of the underground, the weird construction stories, the strange memorial hall. Some of the stories are ridiculous. The construction times are ridiculous. The amount of time in which you could make wine or brandy, even within 2 years, to plant vineyards and then make thousands of gallons of it is impossible. I'm going to say right now, it's impossible to grow grapes, to plant grapes, a vineyard within 2 years and grow them, ferment them, make wine, and then distill that wine enough to have tens of thousands of gallons in 2 years. It is literally impossible. So I don't know if they got the dates wrong, or if this was just a stash of the vineyards already there from some other people that they just took over. I don't know. The story does not make sense. There's a few things that I want to touch on here, this to sell my point here. And first of all, as unlikely as it seems, I feel like a lot of this is fiction. And one of the first clues that you get is when you go check out the Robert Dollar Wikipedia page, Captain Robert Dollar. This is there were 3, but this is the oldest. And it tells you right here, this Freemason, right off the bat, very Dale Carnegie-esque. This James Rolfe Jr. is also a Freemason and very wealthy California governor, made a lot of his wealth in also shipping. So he's basically a rival. And he comes from Scotland, home of the Freemasons, and he becomes a lumber baron immediately, and everything he touches turns to gold. The government essentially gives him all of their old ships. He converts them to passenger service and also handles the mail between America and China. I mean, you don't really just waltz right into that role. And then, of course, right after he dies, they basically view his son as just a freeloader who's just having huge parties at that house and letting the company kind of fade away. And so they basically stole their ships back, and they used them in World War II. He eventually won the case, like I said, in Supreme Court, but even when he won, they didn't give him his company back. They just sold it, probably because they had converted changed the assets too much, and they gave him half the money. And I guess he was happy with that. And his son was just a speedboat racer who seems like a decent enough dude. At least he liked to build his own boats, but just definitely modern day elite. Many of the presidents came to his son's house later and hung out. These are some of the companies he had here. Globe Wireless, I think, is the only one that's still around. He was given one of the first radios, boat radios, and was important in constructing a radio tower and helping them refine that technology. Here's a list of obviously his ridiculous wharves and land and building that he had owned. And this is just from a guy who worked lumber, found his way in California, bought a boat, and suddenly owned fleets and became tens of millionaires. President of the YMCA, president of the Ship Owners Association, chair of the board of directors of San Francisco Theological Seminary, Merchants Exchange, director of Seaboard National Bank, director of London Paris National Bank. I mean, these guys got their hands in everything. How does one become head leader in church, banking, shipping, recreation, education? It's pretty clear he was a planted or connected dude. Here he is, started the San Francisco orphanage because, of course, there's a orphanage that was destroyed after fire in 1913. course, and again in 1922. And so here he is giving back and taking care of the orphans, which always that connection I find to be very creepy. This Dollar family, but this also spotlighted to me some of the strange things surrounding the internet in general. But I figured I'd show you rather than just tell you. It's just turning into a wasteland. It sucks basically. So here is his webpage, and if you go down here to the sources, the references, almost all of these links are broken. I'm sure they probably existed at some point. They said they were last checked sometime in 2016. Most of these were reviewed 2016, but almost all of these links are broken for various websites. There's a few. There's this Times Magazine one, which is just an obituary, but all of these references to the buildings, California Street, 311 CaliforniaStreet.com, gone. Time Magazine articles that are not there anymore. The only ones that are there, the only links that I really got were this little tracking the entire world, kind of a funny name of this website, and a few like the APL, and all of these boats, these pictures of the ships are not there. The ships list is no longer there. And it's just interesting that can happen. Here's an opinion on his life and death. Oh, never mind, not there. Last public appearance. Now, the only ones that show up are this one, these Lake Tahoe histories, which is about the junior, Robert Stanley Dollar Jr., who was just a speedboat racer, which is why he turns up in these Lake Tahoe mysteries. And the Maritime Radio Historical Society also talks about, that's where I got the information about, how he was influential in setting that up. He was allowed to have, now that one's gone too. Okay, well, okay, that just shows, exactly what I'm talking about that. Now, there's a lot of these papers that they have apparently in an archive you can go check out. And I'm not doubting this guy's existence, and in fact, when he died, it seems like his son was not a Freemason, and they just basically just took what they wanted from him and took their ships back. And to just take someone's ships to the point the Supreme Court rules against you 7 years later, but then you still don't turn over the company, just sell half it and give him half the money. He's like, man, okay, just interesting. And this usual story about mother dying young, dad marrying a servant girl, few siblings, working at a lumber camp when he was 14, working his way up to a barrel factory and kind of logger, and eventually just somehow becomes insanely wealthy, building the largest steamers in the world. That led me to thinking about some of the other larger-than-life characters, and that led me to History of Contra Costa. It was published, it's multiple publications of it, and California has all these. I don't know if every state has these, but California has these 1,200-page books detailing the history of every town, every fire, every mayor. I read them all when I do these. So I read the entire book, except for the last 200 pages are like a bibliography, complete with, very strange pictures of people. I don't know how they got all these people to pose for these art forms, or the same age and the same time by the same artist to do these, which that is dubious right there. And it lists all their extensive connections with the various fraternal fellowships and things of that nature, the secret societies. But they are really interesting. One thing I found about this one is the amount of discrepancies that it had with the National Registry of all the information I just told you. For example, things like this, Order of Odd Fellows that were organized here, and these Native Sons of the Golden West with their Grand Mask Ball for the Homeless Children Fund, Fraternal Order of Eagles, all this sort of creepy stuff, and things that kind of clash with what we're told. Here you've got this 3-story building being constructed for the Contra Costa Educational Association, but we were told that was the Riverview building earlier. And of course, this academy, this 3-story building in 1859, the first building in town, destroyed by fire and never rebuilt. Tons of stories like that. Here's some interesting bits about how Mount Diablo got its name. Those stories about a victory about to be a skirmish with some Indians and an unknown personage decorated with the most extraordinary plumage and making diverse movements appeared near the combatants. The Indians win, and so the defeated soldiers say that must have been the devil that helped them win. Just really terrible stuff. Here's one about the oldest town, the first house being built by this George Inglemeyer in 1858. On the upper floor was the Masonic Lodge Room, so right in the very beginning, very first house is built here in just about every town. Here's a weird story about how Mount Diablo got its name. Spanish padres who poisoned gold nuggets and put it in a tub of water and made the Indians make their dogs drink. And when the dogs died, the superstitious fear of the Indians was aroused and they were diverted from using gold as a medium of exchange. So tricking Indians into thinking that gold is poisonous, and that's so stupid. Well, I'm going to put gold in this water bowl and insist your dog drinks it. And then when they die, I'm like, see? This one where the Satan himself appeared in the form of a giant bear, changing from bear to human form, and attacked the padre, who barely survived. This is how Mount Diablo apparently got its name. No one can really decide. Now, John Marsh story, At first, I was about to write this guy off as being a fiction. And I guess it still could be a fiction because his name happens to be the geographical feature he lives in. He's the first white guy from Harvard who shows up and just practices medicine on the Indians, and he's the liaison between them and the rest of the world. But there are some large inconsistencies in his story, and then that led me to looking at online and seeing what else is about him. And there's a bibliography, there's various videos made about him online, people describing his story, and they're all over the place. In some, he's an angry, very cruel person who gets kicked out of Harvard for dropping cannonballs off the roof, and in others, and walking 600 miles through the snow to deliver a mail. All around him is ridiculous stories, and they contradict also, which I would have thought that if you're in the National Register of Historic Places, you would be looking at the history of Contra Costa as for your reference, but it wasn't really. His letters are largely credited with bringing everyone here. And in fact, they're the first settlers that arrived, Anglo settlers, came to his house. He's the one that wrote the story about the Native Indians and really relayed all the information, is an example of some of the inconsistencies. So here, Dr. Marsh had passed the half-century mark without finding a mate. But this isn't true. We're told in other places that he, when he was very young, fell for a French Indian woman named Marguerite, and she died in his arms. Her and her daughter actually had a child with him, and left. And the boy, he presumed the boy had died, but the boy showed up back in California, so from across the country, right before Dr. Marsh's own death. But here, we're told that he was 50 years old, and never had found a mate, and then suddenly Miss Abby Tuck, the name of Abby Tuck, suddenly shows up. They fall in love in weeks, and then she mentions in a letter that there's a house on the property. He won't let her live in it, and she doesn't like the adobe they're in, so he's building her a stone palace. She died before the palace could even be built, and then he died shortly after, brutally murdered and robbed while driving in his buggy, although the sources from this are different. In some cases, it's old employees. In some cases, it's, according to him, it's neighbors. In some cases, it's just random Hispanic dudes. But here's his story-and-a-half cottage. I guess maybe that's the building they're talking about. And the wharf he allegedly built, but somehow occupied by some Frenchmen. I mean, the whole place just seems, the whole history of it just seems crazy, and his writings alone are bizarre, especially the things that he talks about the natives. Now, first here he is talking about how he doesn't even want to write, but he's compelled to write, or he's being blackmailed, or people won't bring him the paper unless he writes, so he's being forced to write against his will. This is what he writes, which is very bizarre. He says certain malicious neighbors of his have entered into a conspiracy against him, teasing him to write articles for newspapers in the United States. So he's being coerced to write correct information relative to California. And so he's enlightening people of the United States about California. He's being forced to do this, is what he's saying, which is interesting. He's forced to write these letters, and the content of these letters are very strange. There's a very heartbreaking bit here in the Contra Costa history about how the white dudes, the bankers, elite, showed up and took advantage of the Spaniards by offering to loan money that these wealthy ranchers that didn't need. I mean, they have land, they have thousands and tens of thousands of acres, and they were just easygoing people, and suddenly he doesn't understand compound interest, and suddenly, the guy never comes back to get his loan, and then the mortgage is foreclosed, and the auction sale, then the creditor, and then the family is kicked out of their own home, and their own, the patriarch and his numerous household are exiled from their home forever. Really disturbing admission by some of these. And of course, this is what they say about the natives in the area. They say, this is Marsh saying that there's 10,000 civilized Indians, 700 Americans in the area, and a million or 2 million wild, naked, brute Indians. Just 2 million wild, naked people running around. It doesn't sound like it was very empty. I mean, 2 million people. It took a long time for California to actually get 200 official population, right? Here's a bit in the country. This is all from the history book. Here's portions of his life seeming like a romance where he was captured on the plains by Indians while they were in the midst of exercising an evil spirit. They were going to offer him as a sacrifice, and he was saved only by wooing and marrying the chief's pretty daughter who interceded for him because she just fell for him so much, like Pocahontas did for John Smith. Like, ridiculous. So he married another petty daughter. So this would be the second Indian woman, Native American second woman that he took for a wife, but then the history here later on says that he had never taken a maid. So there's just a lot of discrepancies in these stories, which I find odd, because it's not like I was even looking for them. About the house that he built, this is interesting, as they say, this is about the new stone house he built, which why are you building a mansion when it's just you and one wife? But they say in the process of time, it may become a beautiful, extensive park, which is odd because that's exactly what it did become. And it is basically like a castle. It's the only property on there, and it's never been open to the public, still to this day, never open to the public. And the house, I saw a video filmed in 2020, the house is still declining. And I'll get more into that a little bit later, which I think is interesting. So this is him saying now that where are the Indians today? It's doubtful you can find a score. They've been decimated. So literally wiped out from, what he was saying earlier, were 2 million, and they're just gone now. The way he talks about them is very disturbing, and it seems to me like it's got to be a lie. So here's saying Pacific Coast Indians were inferior as a race. They live under primitive conditions. They knew nothing. They wander about nude. They eat worms. They don't make homes. They are docile. You can whip them easily and convince them to whip each other easily. And this one, he says that they're a hairy race. Although usually they're beardless, this is admits. He says that the hair in some of them grows all the way down to their eyebrows, like they have no foreheads, almost like they're a chimpanzee. Comparing these Chinese and Tartar races, entirely different from the common American Indian. He's, giving shout out to the proud and lofty bearing of the Indians of the East, but these are timid and stupid, and they eat worms and grasshoppers, and they, in California, and in the land where anything grows, any fruit grows, where there's fish everywhere and game everywhere, no, they're gonna eat worms. They don't even know how to make canoes until the Jesuits taught them how. And I find this to be disturbing and has to be completely false. There's no difference between those people. I feel like this was a justification, a way of saying, oh, they were stupid. That's why they're stamped out. They couldn't survive, and it was just a way of feeling okay about probably what happened. I said that park is that they excavated everywhere they dug. They hit human remains everywhere, and they even dug up the front or the floor of his home and found human remains. So why that's interesting to me is because here we're told that the natives cremated their dead, especially in this area. And it talks about how they did it. Now, here's Dr. Marsh referring to as a race of infants and how willing to be completely subjugated they are. But I'm wondering how they could find so many buried remains so easily in that Dr. Marsh Park when they cremate their dead. And it seems to me like that more and more that there was some civilization or something that was here that was abruptly evacuated. I don't know if they left, raptured up, I don't know, time warped out of here. We're given the option to leave through a space portal, I have no idea. But it seems like a lot of what they left behind was just sort of taken over. The dams fell into disrepair and caused massive floodings, which is why a lot of these places got flooded out. And that, like on the John Marsh property, for example, there's remains of a dam that they're just there. No explanation of who did it, even though he was the only one that lived there. This and all the discrepancies that I find by themselves, they might be meaningless, but this is our history. And so, we trust these people to get it right, else we have to interpret it ourselves. For example, here is a writing about him being killed by 3 of his fired employees, which that's the only place that's ever written. Earlier, we were told that Clayton was the guy that was famous for discovering the vein of coal of the Black Diamond mines. None of these names are Clayton. These is all the men that actually discovered the Black Diamond mine vein and the various mines. I mean, so not a single one was discovered by Clayton, and it says here there was already a town called Clayton at the time that they discovered these mines, so the register has that wrong, apparently. Here, this says that no one knows who organized the Pacheco Fire Engine Company, and no one knows who its first officers were, but we were told that Mr. William Hendrick was on that board, and you would think that this publication here that we're looking at right now, this clip, was this guy Hendrick was the more, it was, just a few years. This is the history. It was just in 1910 or 1915, I think this was reprinted. So very much closer to them than we are now. There's just a lot of little discrepancies like that. And so after I did the whole thing, after I filmed that whole video, I read this book and almost felt like I had to go back and edit it all. Now I didn't. I just decided that I would do it this way instead. It's probably really not very interesting, but once you dive into subject matter and once you're in the pudding, you're thinking about why why would they actually dig up Dr. Marsh's floor when there's an 18,000 whatever acre area that they could dig and explore briefly? And then I came across a little video that was alleging that Dr. Marsh had famously buried treasure, gold in particular, on his property, and people used to go treasure seek there. And then you wonder why, oh, that's why they dug up his floorboards. In the name of archaeological excavations, they were looking for literally treasure. I mean, why else would they dig up the man's floorboards? And all they found was body parts. And why all the body parts? What could have happened here? That's just everywhere you dig, there's dead people. They claim that there's a windmiller culture, one of the very rare instances of windmiller society. Some society lived thousands of years ago, evident because they literally built windmills, and the windmills that they find actual windmills still standing. I didn't know that. You know, the things you learn in these histories is, I don't know if I'm doing a good job of explaining my suspicions. I'm probably not. Between the discrepancies in the history and between the shady stories and fanciful BS stories and the things they got wrong and the selection of sites and the corruption in the historical society itself, fighting, to unpreserved properties, and to the feature of these elite guys, it's just very apparent to me that there is a heavy hand on all this stuff. What exactly they're hiding? I think we get glimpses of it. I think we have a vague idea. Maybe that's the best we'll ever do, but until then, I do feel like these are a bit of a ripoff in a way. They tell a narrative, but it's very filtered. And this one in particular, I feel like the things that slipped through the cracks were not easy to come by. And with the death of the internet, as I showcased earlier, and that's just not just that article. Every time I start to do research, I look at Scriptopedia first to see what's the official story, and then I dive deep from there. Almost all the reference material is dead links now. It's happening more and more at a rapid rate. It's actually very disturbing. So archive whatever you can, man, on like private servers and stuff if you're interested in preserving this, because it'd be interesting to see in a few years what changes are made by our new AI overlords. On that note, this was a very long-winded, and I'm sorry if this was very boring, but there you have it. Contra Costa County and all of my reckless speculations.